G'day guys, I recently hosted a live coaching seminar where I talked about archetypes in Warhammer 40k. We broke down in detail how to identify the different unit archetypes and the different army archetypes, and how to use that information to analyze the game, to write your army lists, to come up with game plans and tactics on the day at the tabletop. So with that being said, let's just jump straight into this live video seminar about unit archetypes.
Look for the Blood God.
G'day guys, I just wanted to take a second to talk to you about the exciting Blog for the Blood God fundraiser raffle, where you can buy tickets for your chance to win a set of neoprene objective markers and a pack of 50 Blog for the Blood God dice. If you'd like to buy some tickets, click on the link in the description of this video. You can scroll down and view the prizes there, and if you'd like to buy some tickets, select buy tickets, select how many tickets you would like to buy, select that you are over 18 and that you agree with the terms, and then I would recommend deselecting the subscription because who needs unnecessary emails, and then you can proceed to fill out your details. If you are an Australian resident, you will be required to select your state. If not, just select any state. It doesn't particularly matter, as long as the street address and details of postage are correct as per above. And then you can go through, proceed on payment, and then it will submit your ticket sales. The reason we've decided to do a raffle in order to raise funds is because this year I have been named as captain for Team Australia for the WTC World Team Championships of Warhammer 40k. This is a once-in-a-lifetime, really exciting opportunity for me. However, as an Australian, that trip is extremely expensive, and unfortunately, life does what it does and has thrown a bunch of unforeseen expenses my way in the terms of veterinary bills for my very sick cat. So any help that we can get to send me to Europe to represent Australia would be greatly appreciated. And also, if there's any money left over at the end, it will go towards improving the quality and frequency of the content here on YouTube. So I very much appreciate any support that you are prepared to give, and I look forward to rewarding that with some exciting prizes. If this does well, we'll do multiple of these raffles because I've got plenty of stuff to give away, and I really do want to show some support for the community that supports me so well. So thank you very much for your consideration. If you'd like to buy a ticket, links are in the description below, and let's get into today's video. Alrighty, well first, thanks for that brief introduction. I'll just briefly summarize it for those of you who don't know me. So I run the YouTube channel Blog for the Blood God. Like we said, I've got 10,000 subscribers over there, and we talk tactics and all that sort of stuff. But for me personally, I've got about 8 years of competitive 40k experience, so I've been in the scene for quite a while. In that time, I've won a whole handful of GTs, a lot of RTTs, that sort of stuff as well. I got best in faction for the ITC multiple years in a row, sometimes with World Eaters, sometimes with Chaos Space Marines. I've been the captain of Team Victoria for the last 2 years. The first year that I was captain, we got the best result that Team Victoria had got in 7 years under my captaincy, so that was something I was quite proud of. And then this year, we've got a very strong team, and I'm very confident that we're going to do quite well. And then this year, I've also been blessed with the title of captain for the WTC team for Team Australia, which is an absolute honour, being able to represent the nation. So that's a little bit about me and my sort of background. Today, what we're going to do, if I can get my thing working, we're going to be talking about archetypes in Warhammer 40k. So there's going to be a bit of a practical guide on how to conceptualize Warhammer 40k units and Warhammer 40k armies. And the goal here is that it's going to enhance your list writing capacity and the way that you approach that, your game plans when you get to the table and what tactics you use, as well as the way you sort of analyze the meta and analyze post-game and come up with an overall strategy. So the presentation is going to be broken down into 3 elements. First, we're going to talk about unit archetypes. We're going to go through some examples. We're going to deep dive that. Then we're going to go through army archetypes and talk about the different ways that you can conceptualize an army. And then we're going to break into a live Q&A. So if you guys have any questions, you feel free to interrupt if you have something that you require a little bit more clarity, or save it till the end and we'll do a bit of a Q&A. And the Q&A is not necessarily exclusively linked to archetypes. So if you have any questions at all about 40k in general, feel free to ask them at the end in the Q&A section. So with that being said, let's just jump straight into it. So unit archetypes. So every unit in Warhammer fits into an archetype. Most of them are hybrids between multiple archetypes, and we'll break down what those archetypes are. So most units are hybrids, but every single unit is at least one archetype. There's no units that exist outside of this archetypical framework. And understanding a unit's archetype can help you develop a list that's well-rounded, that has a specific goal in mind, and it can also help you understand your opponent's list and what goal they might have in mind. And it'll allow you to sort of prepare the matchup and get stuck in with maximal information without necessarily having to know the absolute intricacies of every unit's abilities, every unit's damage output. When you develop the ability to put them in that archetype framework, that's going to allow you to sort of speed through that, so to speak. So the unit archetypes that we're going to break down, you've got the Bully, you've got the Guardian, you've got the Sponge, the Riddler, the Grunts, the Missiles, and the Enhancers. Now these are all just names that I've given them. You can call them whatever you want. This is just my sort of general way of remembering when you're looking at a unit, like what is the overall sort of theme of what that unit does. So I'll give you some examples of bullies. Now, all of the examples that I give here are going to be coming from the perspective of Chaos Space Marines or World Eaters, because they're the armies that I have the most experience and expertise with. However, this obviously, it extends to every faction. Every faction has their variant of these sorts of things. This is going to be some examples that I'm going to use to sort of illustrate the point. So a bully, that's a unit that controls the center of the table. It's characterized generally by high durability and high damage output. So these are your sort of Death Star units. They're generally quite expensive, but they're tough and they hit like a brick shithouse. So you've got an example from the Chaos Space Marines, could be Abaddon attached to a unit of Terminators. It's a really tough unit. It can go into the middle. It's hard to dislodge, and anything that comes near it, it's going to do massive amounts of damage to. So it can sort of bully things around the middle. And then for the World Eaters, an example could be 6 Exalted 8-bound. That's also a unit that's able to get into the middle of the table really fast. It's going to kill anything that it touches, and it's quite hard to kill in return. Toughness 6 with the Feel No Pains and all those sorts of things. So you can use these units to bully the midfield. And by that, what I mean is you go, this midfield is mine. You're not able to take it from me easily. And anywhere I want to go within that midfield, I'm going to be able to go and take it. So it makes it so that you're sort of controlling that middle of the board. So that's an example of a bully unit. Is Guardian next? Yeah, Guardian's next. So a Guardian is a unit that contributes to the fight from your home whilst defending your home, and it often has ranged output. So this could be something like a Defiler or a Forge Fiend, or for World Eaters, it could be a Juggernaut with the Favored of Khorne. So the idea of these units is it's not something that is required in the midfield or in your opponent's deployment zone. This unit is more than happy to hang out in your own deployment zone and contribute to the fight in some way, whether it be via shooting like the Defiler or the Forge Fiend, or whether it be the Juggerlord with the Favored of Khorne in the way that his enhancement can be used to buff things across the board. And he's there to be a unit that can defend your home. So the Defiler is a really good example because it can contribute via its shooting, but also if somebody tries to get into your deployment zone, the Defiler's not afraid to go and charge it and do a bunch of damage in melee as well. So these are the Guardian units that are basically there to protect your home. Next, we've got the Sponges. These are essentially units that force your opponent to waste their resources. So what this generally means is that they're tough units that are really cheap, and often that comes at the trade-off with minimal damage output. And they're basically an annoying thing that when you look at it, you're like, that only costs 70 points, but I'm going to have to throw 150 points worth of stuff into killing it. So it's a way that you can basically waste your opponent's damage output and protect your valuable units. So this could be something like a Humble Rhino, where it's like they're only 75 points, but it takes a lot to put one down, and they protect the units inside. Or it could be something as simple as an Accursed Cultist unit. Now, I know that in the recent update, they lost a lot of steam, but they're still one of those units that's relatively cheap and kind of annoyingly tough. The fact that they can resurrect models and those sorts of things just means that you have to put a lot of work into killing them, and they're not particularly expensive. So they can sort of bait out your opponent's damage and force them to waste it on something suboptimal. Next we have the Riddlers. Now these are one of the most fun units in my opinion, and these are the units that pose your opponent with difficult challenges. So an example could be Khorne Berserkers, how they've got the Blood Surge, and if you put a Master of Executions in there, they have always fights first. And that basically puts a situation where if you have this on an objective marker, your opponent shoots at it and you get to Blood Surge move into them. So they're like, okay, well I won't shoot it then, I'll have to charge it. But if they charge it, it fights first and it does its damage anyway. So it poses a riddle that forces your opponent to come up with some really complex solution. Another one is the Exalted 8-Bound with their no fallback rule, where basically they can tag a bunch of stuff, and then in your opponent's turn, if they want to fall back, they have to take a Battle Shock test, and if they fail, they have to remain stationary. And then you get into the situation where your opponent doesn't know whether it's worth trying to fall back, because if they try to fall back and fail, say you tag 3 units, they try to fall back with the first one, they pass, it successfully falls back, then the next one passes, successfully falls back, but then the third one fails, well now they can't shoot that unit anyway, so they might as well have stayed in combat with it. So it comes up with these little tricks where your opponent's just like, well, what do I do? It's a riddle in their mind. Another one is Angron. He's a really good example where if your opponent kills him, he's likely to be resurrected. So your opponent goes, okay, well then I guess I don't bother killing Angron. But if they don't kill Angron, he's going to run around and just destroy freaking everything, right? So it's a riddle. It's like, what do you do? So they're fun units, little riddlers. The next we have the Grunts, often underappreciated. They're the ones that perform all the menial tasks. So that's things like screening out your opponent, or scoring your secondary objectives like your cleanse and that sort of stuff, where it's like you don't want to waste a damage unit or a bully unit or anything like that doing these things, but somebody needs to do it, right? Example could be Jackals or Cultists. They're cheap units, they sit on objectives, they don't really do much damage, and they're not very survivable, so they're not quite a sponge, and they're not quite a missile or anything like that. They're these sort of soft nothing units, but they perform a very important role in that they take up board space, they stop your opponent from deep striking where they want to, they can do your secondaries like investigate signals while the rest of your army pushes up into the middle and does its damage. Another good example of these is Nurglings. They're really good. You can have 3 units of them in deep strike, and then you just go, cool, on that turn that I draw investigate signals, I just go bop, bop, bop in each corner and score my 6 points. Or you can, if you get behind enemy lines, you can just drop 2 units in your opponent's backfield, and you're like, boop, that's 5 points in the bank. So they're purely in the list for scoring victory points. They're not there to contribute to the battle itself in any way. Then we go on to some of the most fun units, which are the missiles. So these are your expendable sources of heavy damage. So an example could be a unit of 3 Exalted 8-Bound. That's something that can either rapid ingress and then just charge in and kill something. It's going to do massive damage. It's going to take out whatever the target is, but then it's probably going to die in return, right? Or Warp Talons or Chosen for the Chaos Space Marines. These are units that, they're really high damage output, but they're not particularly tough. Mauler Fiends are a good example where they're a fast unit that goes in, it punches, it does a bunch of damage, but generally when it does that, it's going to leave itself exposed and your opponent's going to be able to likely kill it. Or even just little things like, for example, in the World Eaters, you can have Khan the Betrayer, and you can run him on his own, not attached to a unit, and he's a little 100-point guy who's going to go in and he's going to kill 150 points, maybe 200 points worth of Space Marines on his own. He'll just go in and just shred, and then die in return. And it's like, yep, cool. He was a little missile, he went out, he was expendable, and he did heavy damage, right? So that's what the missiles are. And then last we have the enhancers. Now these are the things that buff nearby units. So an example for the World Eaters could be the regular 8-Bound, because they have a 6-inch aura of reroll 1s on your wound rolls. So that's an ability that these guys use that buffs the nearby stuff. Another one is the Chaos Space Marine Hellbrute. It's got that 6-inch aura that allows you to have multiple, you get lethal and sustained, which is really cool. And then another one could be like a Walking Demon Prince that provides an aura of invulnerable saves. So these are all units that, one of the defining characteristics of that unit is that it actually makes the units around it more powerful, not necessarily the power of the unit itself. So before we jump into the army archetypes, we'll just summarize that. So you've got all your different unit archetypes, and remember what I said at the start about how all of these units often fill multiple roles. So you might have, for example, the regular 8-bound. They're an enhancer, but they're also kind of a missile in that you can use them in that capacity. And they're also a bit of a scout. Like, there is also a bit of a Riddler because they have the ability to scout and then move and then advance and charge and do heavy damage turn 1, which means your opponent's in this tricky spot where they go, okay, if I deploy really far back to protect myself from the 8-bound, well, then I'm safe, but I'm not scoring any objectives because I'm not anywhere near the middle of the table. But if I deploy real close, I'm going to get hit by 8-bound turn 1, and I'm going to lose that unit anyway. So you've put them in a bind, you've created a riddle that's going to be hard for them to solve. So regular 8-bound could be arguably an enhancer, a riddler, and a missile. So when you sort of view the units in that context, that helps you sort of put together what your army is going to look like when you basically select how many enhancers do you want, how many riddlers do you want, how do you want these units to function on the tabletop. And it also means when you look at your opponent's units, you can have a better understanding of how they're going to wield them and what they're going to do with those units. We'll move on to army archetypes now. And basically, the army archetypes on the whole is, again, there's hybrids here where the certain armies can fill the role of multiple, but there's generally a pretty strong sense of one or the other here. And it's often the result of the units that go into it. So if you want a certain archetype of your army, that'll inform what unit archetypes you want to include. And this is where it gets into the help when it comes to writing your lists. Once you decide what type of army you want to play, you can then go, okay, now that I know what type of army I want to play, that informs what units to take, because you want to take the archetypical units that belong in that archetypical army. And the really important thing when it comes to army archetypes is that you want to select one based on your individual play style. Some players really enjoy an aggressive army, some really enjoy a defensive army, or any of the other archetypes, which we'll go through in a second. Once you understand what archetype you enjoy playing the most, that will then inform what units you want to take and that sort of thing. I always advise against trying to decide what's the best. I think it's better off deciding on what you enjoy more and then making sure that you master it. Because in my opinion, an aggressive army versus a defensive army, neither of those are objectively better than the other. It just depends on your play style. It's sort of like how they say the best diet is the diet that you'll stick to. Even if there's another diet that's like scientifically, objectively better for you, if it's drinking nothing but soup, like you might be like, fuck that, I'm not doing that. And therefore that diet's not necessarily better because you don't stick to it. So you're better off finding something that you enjoy, that you're good at, and that you have fun with, because you're more likely to develop it, stick to it, and get better results. So that's the sort of army archetype framework. And then you can also look at your opponent's army archetype, and once you identify what their archetype is, that is going to tell you what their game plan is going to be, because you understand what their army is there to do, what it's designed to do. So that helps you when it comes time to deciding how you want to interact with it. So let's go through some of the army archetypes. So you've got aggressive, defensive, technical, and control. So that's the 4 main army archetypes. And obviously there are some hybrids where you might have an aggressive technical army and you might have a defensive control army, but they generally fall into those 4 categories. So an aggressive army, that's generally characterized by an army that's built up with lots of missiles and lots of bullies. So you're looking at their army and you go, cool, they've got a unit of Terminators, or say it's a World Eaters army, you go, cool, they've got a unit of 6 Exalted 8-bound, and then they've got 2 units of regular 8-bound, 2 units of 3 Exalted 8-bound, they've got Angron, they've got Khan and a Rhino, like there's tons of missiles in there, and there's also tons of bullies in there, and you're like, cool, that is an aggressive army, and you can tell how they're going to play it based on that. Another one might be Abaddon with Termes, and Chosen, and Warp Talons, and all those sorts of things, where you're like, yep, cool, they've got a bully unit, that unit being a bully is going to push into the middle and try to control it, and then from there, they're going to launch all these missiles at you from all over the board. Then you go to defensive army. This is typically something that's got lots of sponges, lots of bullies, and lots of guardians. So this one, it's like the aggressive one, but trade out the missiles that normally go out and do their damage for sponges. And these are, of, like we said, your big, tough units that are relatively cheap and do very little damage. They're going to have a whole bunch of them, and then they're going to have guardians dotted throughout that are going to be contributing to that fight from the safety of their deployment zone. An example for World Eaters might be multiple Lords of Skulls. So you might think, how do you run a World Eaters army that's defensive? Well, if they have multiple Lords of Skulls, chances are they're going to just push up into the middle and sit there. And they're going to play, and they, from that position, they're going to play a relatively defensive game. They're going to sit there and they go, cool, my whole army's toughness 13. You can't kill that much toughness 13. So I'm just going to sit here on the objectives and be tough, right? That's a very defensive play style. For Chaos Space Marines, it might be multiple units of Terminators with Lords in them so that they gain access to the free armor of Contempt. And it's like, cool, this army is slow, it doesn't have the capacity to be aggressive, but it has lots of bullies, and it's going to sit there, and it's going to be really tough to kill and just control the midfield objectives. The next one is Technical. Now, this is armies that have lots of Riddlers and Enhancers. Now, the World Eaters and the CSM aren't perfect examples of armies that often lean into Technical, but they can. So, an example for a World Eaters Technical could be lots of Rhinos with Berserkers with Masters of Executions in them. That army can be quite technical because you can use your Rhinos in interesting ways to disembark, and then you charge the Rhino in to prevent their pile-ins, and you can do all this weird stuff with pulling casualties in order to get your Blood Surge moves to go a certain direction. And then you've got all your fights first activations happening all over the place, and it's like a real technical sort of game that you're playing with lots of Riddlers. For Chaos Space Marines, it could be something like Chaos Bikers that can teleport, and then Huron for redeploys, and now you're playing a real technical game where you're like, cool, I'm deploying in such a way to trick my opponent into thinking that I'm going to do X, but then I'm going to use Huron to redeploy these units, then I'm going to put Bikers near the table edges so that I can pick them up and redeploy them and do all this crazy stuff that plays a real technical game. So even though it's not necessarily a defensive list, it's not prioritizing toughness, and it's not an aggressive list in that it's not prioritizing that alpha strike damage capacity. It's prioritizing tricks and riddles to prevent your opponent from really knowing what you're going to do at any given time. The next one is Control. So this is armies with lots of grunts and lots of bullies. So as opposed to the defensive style that has bullies and sponges, this one has the grunts. So lots and lots of things that are going to basically control the scoreboard. So you're going to have, for World Eaters, an example could be the Demon Prince with lots of Jackals and Exalted 8-pound. And the idea here is basically you've got the Demon Prince giving the invulnerable save to the Jackals. You've got the Exalted 8-pound locking your opponent into the middle of the boards where they're not able to fall back. And then you're just flooding the board with objective control. And that way you're going to score massive victory points. You're probably not going to do a massive amount of damage because all those Jackals are doing bugger all. And you're going to die relatively fast because these aren't sponges, these are grunts. They're just out there to do the work, get the objectives, get the victory points, block your opponent's movement, screen them out, stop them from doing what they want to do. But at the end of the game, you're going to look at the scoreboard, you're going to be practically tabled, but you're going to look at the scoreboard and you're like, I win because I was playing a very control-based game where I'm controlling what happens and where. A CSM example could be just Legionaries and Rhinos, and then a Cursed Cultist and regular Cultist, and you just go, cool, I've got all of these things that have high OC, and I'm just dominating the objectives. I'm jumping out onto the objectives, I'm cleansing them, I'm jumping out and I'm doing my deploying teleport homers. I've got multiple units that can get into my opponent's backfield, maybe you've got some Nurglings in there and that sort of stuff, so you're just scoring massive amounts of points, and you're controlling what your opponent's able to do in their turns. So that's an idea of a control army. And then, more or less to summarize all of that is that understanding the unit archetypes allows you to better plan out and understand the elements of your army and what army archetypes you and your opponent are playing. And when you identify what the archetype is, you're then able to play around it. So an example of this could be something like, if you identify that they're going to be playing a very aggressive army, they're going to be playing really hard, they're going to be going missiles at you, they're going to be doing all of this sort of stuff, you can try to deny them that by either playing real conservative early so that they're wasting their time, they're sending these missiles out but they're not able to connect with you because you're too far away, and then when you spring out onto their missiles, they have now lost the main thing that defined their army's archetype. Once they lose their missiles, they don't have the grunts to go and do their objectives. They don't have the units that are going to control the midfield. If you can pull them forward and then drop behind them, they don't have the guardians that are going to be able to defend their home. So being able to use the archetypes to go, okay, cool, I'm looking at your army and all I'm seeing is missiles, well, then you know how to play around that. Also, if you're looking at your opponent's army and you go, cool, you've actually only got one unit in your army that's a bully, right? If you can isolate that bully early and take care of it, or if you can come up with a scenario where you're actually able to coordinate multiple units to deal with their bully, well, once they lose the bully, they lose the ability to control the midfield. So being able to do that is a really effective way of dealing with somebody who's trying to play like that defensive play style, because you can go, cool, you're defensive and therefore you don't have the capacity to take my home. If I can defeat your bully and I take the middle, you don't have the missiles that would be required to take the middle back, and you don't have your bully, so from there you just lose. So when you understand, okay, what's their army archetype? Oh, they're playing a defensive game. Okay, cool. What's the one thing that if I remove from their army, they're no longer going to be able to secure those victory points? So that's sort of an idea on how you can view the opponent's army, view your army, look at it through the lens of, instead of looking at specific data sheets and trying really hard to understand every single data sheet, what every single thing does, how it all interlocks with each other, that can be really taxing. And especially when you get paired into somebody and you look at their army and you don't know it well, it's not a reasonable thing to ask to understand their army in 5 minutes, right? So being able to look at it and just go, okay, cool, I understand the archetype of that unit. I understand the general gist of it. It's a fast unit that does combat damage. Cool, that's all I need to know. I don't need to know how many attacks. I don't need to know what damage. Just, what is it? Is it a fast unit that does damage? Cool. It's a missile. I'll plan around versing somebody who has multiple missiles. And yeah, hopefully that gives you guys a little bit of an understanding on one of the ways that we conceptualize things. And then also when you're writing a list, make sure that I generally advise people try to include at least one of every unit archetype. So make sure that you do have a bully, because you want to be able to control the middle at some point, at least to some capacity. Make sure that you have some sponges, some grunts. You've got to have a little bit of everything. Not every army has everything. Like, I'm predominantly a World Eaters player, and World Eaters definitely don't have all of those elements. But you want to make sure you're writing a rounded list that has as many of those elements as you can include within reason. So, yeah, so that's my general thoughts on unit archetypes.
Blog for the Blood God exclusive high quality dice. Blog for the Blood God exclusive high quality dice. Blog for the Blood God exclusive high quality dice.
Hi, I'm Dean Simbeck, President and CEO of Blog for the Blood God's exclusive high-quality dice warehouse and emporium. Due to a shipping error, I'm currently overstocked with Blog for the Blood God exclusive high-quality dice, and I'm passing the savings on to you!
Roll 9-inch charges, pass invulnerable saves, roll high for damage, and score lots of hits.
Check out the links in the description of this video to pick up your set today.
Did you guys have, did anybody have any questions on the archetypes themselves? Yeah, any questions at all, but I guess before we move into general questions, if anybody has any questions on the archetypes themselves.
I guess I'll be the one to ask then. In that situation, is there a recommendation? Well, I'm going to go because we're looking at this specifically for a pairing aspect with teams and whatnot. Two-part, I guess. Is there a specific, not the unit archetypes, but the army archetypes that would play? I mean, if they're playing aggressive, you want to go defensive and use a pair-defensive one first, then more often, or so on.
Yes. So I guess if I understand the question correctly, because apologies, the speaker on my laptop is atrocious. The question is essentially that in a team's environment, is there an ideal strategy for pairing certain army archetypes into other archetypes? So a lot of people, what they'll do is they'll put up like a defensive list, but the problem there is defensive lists are actually quite vulnerable to control lists. Because the idea of a defensive list is that it doesn't do a massive amount of damage, right? But it's really hard to kill. But control lists, or technical lists as well, they're not necessarily interested in damaging you, right? Their priority is just going out onto objectives and controlling the board and achieving their secondaries, right? So if somebody puts up a defensive list, like it might be a custodies list, they're quite typical of a defensive list, right? They're not super fast. They're not going to be able to go out project massive damage. You know, they can't shoot things down. Often they can't deal with big mech or anything like that. So they're quite defensive in their playstyle. So if you go, cool, well, we're going to pair our technical Eldar list into you, and instead of worrying about trying to actually kill you, we're just going to score massively on our secondaries. We're going to deny you your primary where we can, and we're just not going to engage. We're just going to dance around you. That can be a really effective way of neutralizing a defensive list. However, if they put up something that's, say it's a control list, aggressive lists love going into control, because control lists, they don't put any effort into being defensible. They don't put any effort into being durable. They're all about just achieving the victory points. And one of the main ways that aggressive lists win games is the aggressive list goes in and just tables you in 2 turns. And if you don't have sufficient defense, you're not going to be able to stop them. And if they go in and they table you in 2 turns, it doesn't matter how many tricks you've got, you're dead. So this is definitely something that you can use in a team's environment to your massive advantage when you understand the way that the various interactions work between lists. It's almost like a rock, paper, scissors in a way. And like I said at the start, a lot of the armies are hybrids, so you might have a list that's like a half defensive, half control. So with that caveat put aside, generally you've got aggressive lists beat control lists beat defensive lists, and then defensive lists beat technical lists, generally speaking. But obviously there's a lot of variation within that. But yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Yep, all good.
Have you ever, for instance, instead of looking at a particular one model or unit and its archetype or role it fills, do you ever look at groups of units or portions of units? So, I love one predator on its own might not be a bully or anything like that, but if you've got the 3 with the hell brute, for instance, you ever like group them up and consider their role change?
Absolutely. So there's a theory called critical mass, right? And the Lord of Skulls defensive world leaders list is a good example of that, where one Lord of Skulls on its own, that doesn't necessarily make a defensive archetype of an army. It also isn't necessarily that defensive of a unit, because one Lord of Skulls, generally people have enough damage output in their army to delete one Lord of Skulls. But what happens when you have 2 or 3 is you then use those 2 or 3 to target the 1 or 2 things in their army that effectively deal with the Lord of Skulls. And if you can deal with them, maybe they kill one of them, one of your guys, but by the time they've done that, you've taken out their capacity to deal with the other 2. So a single Lord of Skulls isn't particularly defensive, but 3 of them definitely is. So the same could be said for a bully unit. Like a lot of units, depending on the size or the loadout, they also change roles considerably. And yeah, you're absolutely right, is that sometimes you might go, cool, you know, a single predator isn't much of a guardian. You know, it's going to sit in your backfield, it's going to contribute a little bit, but it's not going to contribute anything meaningful. You know, if somebody puts out a unit, that one predator is not going to kill that rhino, right? So it's like, well, what's it even doing? Like softening things up for the other stuff to go in? But that's not particularly interesting. Whereas if you go, well, actually I have 3 predators there, now it's a very different, you know, different unit. There's also something to be said for units that they can pivot roles within a certain context. So you might have like a Vindicator, and it's like you could use that Vindicator in some matchups as a Guardian. You're like, it's a tough unit that's going to sit in my backfield. It's going to be able to contribute by, if I just park it here where it can see that objective in the middle. Now, if my opponent goes onto that objective, they're copping a Vindicator to the face, right? They're not going to enjoy that. And if they try to get into my deployment zone, even if they tag the Vindicator, it can still shoot its blast weapon into combat. So it's effectively a decent melee unit as well, and it's within the deployment zone, so it can operate as a bit of a guardian. But you could also, in certain matchups, put it in strategic reserves and outflank it and blast something in their home and use it almost like a missile. So some units actually do have the capacity to not play 2 roles, but to play one or another role. You know, something like a Defiler, it plays 2 roles simultaneously, right? But something like a Vindicator, it can play either a defensive role or like either a Guardian role, or it can play a like the role of a missile. And those units are really, really interesting because what that allows you to do is actually somewhat influence your own army archetype in between rounds. So if you're playing against somebody who's really control based, you can be like, yeah, I'm going to use my thing as a missile here because that means my army tilts a little bit more aggressive, and aggressiveness beats control. But if you're up against somebody who's really aggressive, you might go, okay, I'm going to use my Vindicator as more of a defensive piece because it's tough, it's going to be hard for them to crack, and it's going to be able to contribute to the fight early. So that's really interesting that some units actually do pivot roles depending on what you need them for. That was a really good question. Does anybody else have any questions they want to add?
Well, since we got it and you came up, for example, what would you recommend? Do you recommend certain roles for certain armies? Like if I gave you a list of 8 different armies, would you tell us the recommended archetypes for them? Or is that cheating?
No, so the recommended archetypes for each faction. I think most factions are capable of fielding any of the archetypes, but some most certainly lean into certain archetypes. So I could definitely recommend certain archetypes for certain armies. And also, if you were to, if there was a certain number of lists, you could recommend, what's going to be an effective counter. If they put up this, do you want to put in an aggressive list or do you want to put in a defensive list? That's definitely something that you can consider as well. It's just worth noting that like every army that somebody puts together is going to vary quite wildly. So it's not like you can just say, oh, Tau always play very control-based armies. Even if the most Tau might, there'll be some people that'll run just like a ridiculous amount of really fast battle suits and just shove them in your face. And it's like all of a sudden that Tau army's aggressive as hell, right? Whereas if they're running like Ghost Keels, well, now it's like it's almost a technical army because you've got the ability for your opponent to use that lone op to create a bit of a riddle for you, where it's like you can't shoot me from all the way over there, but if you come closer to be able to shoot me, you're now going to fall into my like kill zone, and I'm going to be able to blast you. So you put your opponent in real tricky spots. So every faction is definitely capable of and often does play multiple different play styles. Space Marines are a really good example. Of course, they're probably the most diverse of all factions. You're going to have the Ironstorm list where it's just a parking lot full of tanks. And you're like, that's just a hyper defensive list. It's like, cool. My whole deployment zone is just bricked out as a car park. It's tough as hell. And anything that comes out into the middle is going to get bullied, right? So that's a real defensive playstyle. But they can also run it with Blood Angels, and they can be teleporting around the unit of Centurions and just las-cannoning the shit out of things whilst launching all these missiles into you, and they can play it really aggressive as well. So Space Marines is one where it's like, looking at Space Marines and saying what archetype are they, what would you recommend, it's actually really, really hard. Which is why when it comes to selecting your own army, I recommend strongly find which playstyle you enjoy the most, and then just roll with that. And don't stress too much about, is my Necron army supposed to be defensive or is Necron supposed to be aggressive? Just go, nope, I like the aesthetics of Necrons, so I'm going to pick all of the aggressive units because I like to play aggressively. And I guarantee you'll get better results doing it that way than you will otherwise. And then you can always, over time, temper your play style. So, for example, for me, I've always been an aggressive player. And I used to play just nothing but missiles. And I would just send everything. Every time I'd play, I'd try to get turn 1 charges, and I'm just going to go really hard. But, over the last few years, I've really tempered that, and I've started playing more of a trading game, where it's more of a technical game, where instead of just throwing everything out turn 1, I'm like, cool, I'm going to hold these units, I'm going to put that one that one grunt unit out there that's really cheap, really easy to kill. It might be, a couple of spawn or something like that. I'm going to put them out onto an objective, and I'm going to bait my opponent. So now my opponent has to send something big in to kill the spawn, and then I can send something big in to kill their big thing. And now they've lost their big thing, but I still have mine. So learning that style play where I'm actually baiting them in for an alpha strike so that I can launch a beta strike, as opposed to the old me that was just always about alpha strike all day, every day. So you'll definitely evolve over time, and you can temper it, but that all comes from following your heart, following what you enjoy.
Lee, when are you going to ask the real question? What archetype you should find the sisters?
What archetype should you...
He just answered it. Any way I want.
Yeah.
Nice.
That's a lot.
So, Sisters of Battle is actually a really interesting one because they're almost as diverse as Space Marines, in my opinion. There's the Combat Sisters is really, really interesting because they can play quite aggressive because they can use Miracle Dice to increase their charge range. They can launch out of transports. And they've got a whole ton of stratagems that make the fight phase really interesting. The way that they can force you to fight certain things. So you can charge 3 units in, charge 1 unit in there, another unit here, and then a third unit of Crusaders or something in there as well. You fight here first, and that way if your opponent is going to try to interrupt, you can go the second they interrupt, you can force them to fight the Crusaders, and then they kill 2 Crusaders, and then you kill that unit as well. So Sisters are one of the few armies that in combat, playing aggressively, can actually dominate multiple fronts in a single fight phase. Most armies can't do that. So they play that style really well. But then they also have some of the best shooting in the game. They've got really good quality indirect. They've got those tanks, I can't remember the name, Castigator tanks. They're quite good. They're quite points efficient. They do good work. You've got Morven Val and her unit with the reroll hits and wounds, really, really strong. So
let's use... Sorry, that one has a specific example, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
So, I've been comparing this to my stuff because I'm the sister player.
Yep.
Arcoflagellants, I definitely see as being more just sponges because they're just going to sit there and absorb stuff.
Absolutely,
kind of a bully on anyone who's a 4+ or 3+ save.
Yep.
But with Brawl's unit, I'm kind of torn on where their actual role is because if they're out in the open as a type of a bully type unit, they still weather under decent range of fire.
They do.
Whereas if they can get that strike, what I've been doing a lot with them is putting them in reserve and then rapid ingress.
Yep.
To try and get them to somewhere where they're usable.
Yeah, so I would view Morven and the Paragon unit as a missile. So that's a unit that you're absolutely right. You want to outflank it most often, and you're going to want to rapid ingress it most often. But what you want to do is you want to bring it on in such a way that it's going to do massive amounts of damage, and that you're not too upset if it dies in return. Because it's probably going to, because when it comes in, it's gonna absolutely dominate something. It's gonna blow a hole in your opponent's army. Your opponent's gonna freak out. And they're not going to let you just keep shooting them. They're not going to let you just do that again and again and again. They're going to respond, and they're going to try to take it out. So the idea with missiles is, they can be quite expensive units, but when they come in, they generally want to do more damage than what they're worth. Morven's units are interesting. It's kind of like it's almost a missile bully hybrid, where it's it can come in, rapid ingress, blow something up, and then move into cover somewhere in the middle and be quite hard to shift. That, like you said, they will shift it, but it's going to take so much of their army to shift it that it allows the rest of your army to move up. And often what will happen is people will make the mistake of putting all of their firepower into Morven's unit to kill it, and they've just wasted their entire army to kill 1 unit when they could have used their army to kill 3 of your other units. And sometimes taking out 3 of your opponent's units is better than taking out that 1 good unit. So that's another point we're talking about, when you're conceptualizing, looking at your opponent's archetype and then thinking, how do I beat it? Often one of the best ways to do it is if they've gone too heavy on bully units, they might have an aggressive army that's 2 big bully units and 4 or 5 missiles, or it might be a defensive army that's 2 big bully units and then a couple of grunts. If they do that, one of the best ways to beat them is to just take out all of their support elements. Take out all of their missiles, take out all of their grunts or their sponges, and ignore the bullies. Because realistically, if they only have 1 or 2 bully units left, well, they're only controlling 1 or 2 objectives. And in order for them to deal with you, they would have to leave the objective, which they don't want to do. So eliminating those other elements is key. So if you put Morven out and you do massive damage with Morven's rerolling hits and wounds and doing all the miracle dice shenanigans to get really high damage rolls and all that sort of stuff, and then your opponent goes, oh my god, and they fire everything they have in to killing Morven, that's actually probably what you want. You'd probably be happier with that than if they took that shooting and killed like 2 Castigators, a unit of Repentia, 2 units of Crusaders. You'd rather them just kill Morven and her unit. And if you bring it on from Rapid Ingress somewhere where you can then move it in your turn into somewhere where it's relatively safe, make it so it's hard for your opponent, they have to commit a lot of damage, they have to move in such a way that they don't want to. Maybe they had a Vindicator that was heading that direction, and then you've gone, oh, well, here's Morven over here, and now they have to turn around with the Vindicator and come back because they need that Vindicator's damage to deal with Morven. So you've been able to waste a turn of their movement. That sort of thing is how I conceptualize using Morven, which is kind of a missile/bully unit.
Okay, thank you. Actually, that's a big one to try out because I try to keep her as safe as possible. There's a lot, sisters have a lot of throwaway units, and there's a lot of stuff I'm happy to let die, but that is one of the ones I usually try pretty hard to keep alive, or at least always in combat, so it's harder to kill.
Yep.
So that's a different way to think of it. Something to definitely try with her.
Yep, cool.
Thanks.
I just got a question with that. So, in that situation, actually, I was playing against Levon and his sisters, and he did that with Morgan. Just got in the back, got through, I think it was like a squad of cultists, and I had Abaddon just on his own as a reroll machine.
Yep.
At what point do you just go, nah, leave it in the back and just let it run free, or like you said, do you turn around and invest 3 times as many points trying to kill it because you just bad dice and you just don't have anything else like ready to do anything?
So it can be hard. It can be really hard to know when to assign resources like that. My general advice is to, and this is general advice that works across all kinds of contexts, but specifically here, is always be checking the scoreboard and looking at where you're at. And in the instance where, let's say, the sisters players got their indirect and they've popped a hole in your backfield that you can't replenish, and then next turn Morven rapid ingresses into the hole that they created, and now you're like, well, fuck, I got Morven in my backfield. This is a huge problem. If you look at the scoreboard, you might realize, well, I actually don't need to hold my home anymore, right? I can actually just push up into the middle, and as long as I'm controlling the 3 objectives in the middle, I'm still going to be scoring my 15s, so I don't need my home. Or maybe if you push hard enough that way, you're going to be able to take the sisters home, and then you've actually just swapped. They've taken your home, but you've taken theirs. And now Morven is so far away, because you've basically ran away from Morven. Now, Morven's just sitting on a home objective doing nothing. And that's a trade you're happy with. You're happy for them, Morven, to come on, kill your cultists off your home. You still score that in your turn because it's sticky, and then they're going to have to spend another turn moving to take it from you. That's probably a perfectly fine trade. It all just depends on the locations of your units, and importantly, what the scoreboard is, and how desperately you need your home. If you're looking at it and you're like, wow, if he takes my home, I'm nowhere near his home, so I don't have the capacity, which means I'm going to be pincered in the middle of the table, and then Morven's going to collapse in, and then a big unit of Archetypes is going to wrap around me, and I'm going to be in a lot of trouble. Well, in that instance, maybe it is appropriate to send something like Abaddon back to go dig you out of that hole.
Yeah, right. Cheers, man.
Yeah. Any other? We've got a sisters player and we've got a Chaos Space Marines player. What other players have we got on the call?
Templar.
Templars.
it looks more like an Iron Hands one. I've got a lot of gun.
A lot of guns. Templar, have you got the unit of Sword Brethren with Helbrecht?
No, so I'm actually, funny enough, I'm working on Hellbreak now. I'm going to try doing 20-man death ball of chainswords with a Castellan.
Yep.
And having a 10-man squad at the back and a couple of flamers to screen out. And then having all the big units in between that big ball and just pushing forward. But I've been playing really aggressively.
Yep.
Trying to learn just doing open war between orcs. I was just playing really defensively, like classic castle doctrine. Might as well have been playing bloody Imperial Fists.
Yeah. Yeah, no, the Templars are an interesting one. I think they have the capacity to run probably the most balanced army, in that they have elements that are bullies, they have elements that are guardians, they have technical elements, they have, basically they can run multiple of every archetype, which allows them to be one of the most flexible armies in the game. But sometimes that flexibility comes at a trade-off in that you don't necessarily excel at any one thing. Whereas like World Eaters are just easily the most aggressive army in the game. They are the best at being aggressive. Whereas Templars aren't really the best at anything in particular. They're just really good at lots of stuff.
One thing I've been noticing is control issues with it. I don't obviously have much jump pack sort of stuff or deep strike.
Yeah.
But yeah, the bit of a lack of control, and as soon as stuff like investigate signals pops up.
Yeah, and so this is an example of when you're writing the list, you're identifying that. So maybe one of the good things you can add as a Templars player to fix that is the Inceptors with the plasma guns. They're really good because they have a 3-inch deep strike rule, so they're really good at going and getting things like signals behind enemy lines. They can even drop onto an objective that your opponent is on and contest it, which is really fun. So that's you've just identified there when looking at your list that one of the areas that you struggle is you don't have enough control pieces. You don't have enough of what we would call grunts. I call the Inceptors a grunt, where it's like the purpose of adding them to the list isn't because they're particularly durable. It's not because they're particularly high damage output, but you need something that can go get you those objectives. Something that can, if you draw cleanse, you can go, cool, I've actually got 3 units of Inceptors, so I'm going to use 2 of them this turn. I'm going to deep strike onto those 2 objectives and cleanse them, and now happy days. Or you draw investigate signals and you're like, cool, I can actually drop these guys in my opponent's backfield. And they're also really good in the way that if they do drop in your opponent's backfield, chances are your opponent is going to have to send something back, because they're going to kill the thing that's on your backfield, and then because they're a ranged unit, they're going to be able to actually contribute to the fight from your opponent's backfield. So I'm a big fan of the Plasma Inceptors, or the Heavy Bolter ones. You can take either one. They're either's fine. Because generally speaking, the purpose of the unit isn't necessarily to do damage, it's to be able to give you those control elements. And that's sort of...
Give them a bit of a dilemma too.
Yeah, exactly. They're a bit of a... they're almost a bit of a Riddler unit, because your opponent's like, well, I want to screen out my backfield to stop him from jumping in, but trying to screen out something that has a 3-inch deep strike is almost impossible. It requires so much commitment that if your opponent does commit enough to stop you from deep striking behind them, well, now they don't have anywhere near enough elements to fight for the middle of the board. So you put them in a bit of a riddle where it's like, well, do you want to defend your backfield or do you want to play in the middle? You can't do both. And as a result, they're almost always going to leave you that opening in the backfield. So yeah, perhaps looking into either adding some of them, or the other approach that you could do is, instead of trying to round out the list and make it so that it's multifaceted, lean heavier into one element, and then it doesn't matter so much that you don't have the others. So you might go, I'm going to lean even further into defensiveness, and I'm going to take, like, it might be a big unit of Terminators, or it might be a big unit of Aggressors, or something that's relatively tough, and I'm going to basically use that to bully the midfield while my tanks hold my home, and I'm just going to make it so that my opponent can never get in my deployment zone, because anytime they try, I just blow them up. So they're never getting in my deployment zone, which means your opponent's not getting their signals, the opponent's not getting engaged on all fronts, They're not going to be able to get behind enemy lines. So even though you're not going to be able to achieve those things, neither is your opponent. And that way you're denying them out of that side of the game, and then you're just pushing for the middle. And if you can control the middle over them, well, then you win. So you can sort of forego the diversity, and instead of trying to make sure you have units of every role, you can just lean hard into one thing, which is what I do with the World Eaters. I just lean hard into aggression, and it's like, cool, I can't defend the board at all. If my opponent wants something, they can have it, right? But what I can do is take things from them, and I can just go full ham and do massive damage to them, and that's sort of my own defense in a weird way. Is a good offense is a good defense sort of thing.
Yeah, I understand.
Yeah.
I guess our next one's actually a text question. Not sure if you can see it, or I can read it out for you if you'd like.
I can't see anything, so.
Yeah, no worries. So our Orcs player is asking, he's saying he's struggling to find the ideal time to commit and utilize his flash gets when he's not losing the truck during T1 over aggressive deployment and movement, which I've already dealt with. I'm telling you, stop deploying it there. He's looking for any general strategy tips for overcoming the fear of losing his shooting units too early. It's his only big shooting unit is that full flash gets with Adrock, I think.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the unit. So it sounds like he's using the unit as a bit of a missile, right? Where it's like it comes out, it does heavy damage, but it's not particularly durable, and therefore it often gets deleted pretty quickly thereafter, right? So if you're sending out your missile, this advice will apply to any type of missile that you're using, and that is that if you're not in a position where you're happy to lose the unit, don't use the unit. So often when I'm playing with my 8-bound, it's like, cool, my opponent puts something small out onto the objective, and I'm like, cool, I could go and kill it with my 8-bound, but if I do that, I'm going to lose my 8-bound, and then I'm not going to have the ability to deal with this other big threat, right? So in those situations, you don't send the 8-bound, or in this case, the flash kits. If they put something onto an objective, and you're like, yeah, cool, the flash kits could easily go out there and blast that. If you then look at it and go, yes, but if I'm here at the end of my turn, he's going to be able to move around here and draw a line of sight on me and kill all my flash kits. And now I'm trading a 300-point flash kit unit, or however much they cost, I don't know. But you're trading an expensive unit of flash kits that have a character attached, and if you use the transport to get there, you're trading that expensive unit for something small. Then you're probably better off keeping the flash kits in their truck, and then using something else to deal with that threat. Or sometimes, and this is really, really hard to do, but like emotionally hard, sometimes you just have to let your opponent have that objective. If they put something onto an objective and you're like, okay, the only way that I can kill them off that objective is to sacrifice my flash kits. But if I sacrifice my flash kits, I now don't have the ability to deal with this unit or that unit, right? Well, you're like, okay, well, I'm actually just going to let them score the 5 points for that primary objective, and I'm just going to take a turn to position myself in such a way that I'm safe, and next turn I can threaten those big scary units in a way where I'm not trading. So you might go, cool, in my first turn I'm deploying the truck that has the flash kits in it out of line of sight behind a ruin that's sort of deeper into my deployment zone, and then they move on to a central objective, and you've got two options. You either move out, blast them, but you're vulnerable, or you move the truck, you advance the truck over, and you jump in the next ruin that's a little bit further up, and you're still safe because you're in a ruin, you're out of line of sight, and now they can't deal with you, and next turn you're going to be able to jump out onto a middle objective, blast something from somewhere that's safe, their retaliation is going to be smaller, and you can sort of, play it that way. So I guess the trick is not making bad trades is the best way to do it. And just, if your opponent proposes a bad trade, just tell them, no, I'm not going to take your trade. You don't have to take every trade that is proposed. But it also depends on the other elements in your list. Ideally, you want to make sure that in your list you have some things that are missiles that can go kill big things and do heavy damage. Then you want to have some things that go, okay, they put out, maybe they put out a unit of 3 Nurglings onto an objective somewhere. Nurgling's probably not a great example because they're OC0, but, some small unit that's like 10 cultists or something. You want to make sure that you have something that can reliably kill 10 cultists, but is not going to do much damage to a unit of Space Marines or something. So that might just be like a unit of boys, or a unit of Storm Boys, or something like 5 Storm Boys, where it's like, cool, if they put 10 cultists on an objective, I can send my 5 Storm Boys in, and now I can hold my flash kits, and I don't need to use them, and I can keep them safe, so that the Storm Boys can die. I don't care about them. They're a 50-point unit of nothing. And you sort of tell your opponent, every time they try to trade you something small, you trade back with something small, and you save your big trade pieces, your big missiles, for when they put out something big. But it's always hard, that. But yeah, any other questions on this stuff?
I suppose I'll have one final one before we can leave, since I'm holding everyone hostage. Tactical versus fixed.
Oh yeah. So
I guess at what point do you look at doing it? I'll keep using myself as an example. I have Vol in my list specifically just for generating CP, which means I lean very heavily into fixed.
Yep.
Which does mean the player on the other side of the table knows what I'm trying to do and can try and fight against it. So I guess that'd be, at what point do you want to look at that?
So I actually did a video on this topic on my channel recently, talking about when to take tactical and when to take fixed. But to summarize it here for you, it depends on your list. I always take tactical. And essentially the reason that I do that is, generally speaking, if you take fixed and say you take deploy teleport homers and behind enemy lines or something like that, right? Or maybe your opponent's got a bunch of characters, so you're like, I'll take assassinate and deploy teleport homers, right? Generally what you're saying, if you take any of the ones that require doing an action, whether it be cleanse or teleport homers or anything like that, you're saying that I'm going to be able to dispose of one unit every turn to do an action, right? And then if you take assassinate against them, you're basically saying, I have the damage capacity to go in and kill something specific more or less every turn. And if you have a disposable unit every turn and the damage capacity to kill something every turn, you can probably just get away with tactical, and you'll probably be able to achieve most of your cards anyway. And the beautiful thing about tactical is, as you alluded to, you can generate command points from it, and not every army has the capacity to do that. And also, your opponent doesn't know, like you alluded to, they don't know what your cards are. They don't know what you're going to get next turn. Whereas if you take deploy teleport homers and behind enemy lines, your opponent knows, okay, well now if I can screen out my backfield, my opponent is going to really struggle to score their secondaries, right? And that can be an absolute disaster for you. Or if you take assassinate, they might go, you know what, I actually don't need these characters in this game, so I'm going to put the unit with the character in, I'm going to put them in reserves, and I'm just going to play it safe. I'm not going to bring that unit out until I absolutely need to, and I'm going to do it in such a way that he's not going to be able to retaliate and kill my characters. You know, when the unit's killed down, say it's 10 Terminators in Abaddon, when it's killed down to 2 Terminators in Abaddon, they can just fucking run away. And now it's like, now you're spending your time chasing Abaddon around the place, when if you had taken tactical, you might not have needed to do that. So my advice is to more or less always choose tactical. And the only exception that I will give is if your army has the ability to generate command points, then tactical becomes less appealing. And then only if you've specifically designed your army to achieve a very specific secondary. So you might be a Tyranids player where you've got the Biovores that you can launch Spore Mines, and then Spore Mines can do actions and score you behind enemy lines. You're like, cool, I'm going to max those out. That's no problems. Or maybe you're, you're Grey Knights and you have the ability to pick up your units at the end of your turn and deep strike them in your opponent's. You go, or at the end of your opponent's turn and deep strike them in your turn. You might go, well, behind enemy lines is great because I can deploy. My opponent has to come out, and then I can pick up and go into their deployment zone turn 2, and now I'm going to be scoring my behind enemy line points all game. So it really does depend. Typically speaking, when you're versing an aggressive army, fixed becomes much more appealing, because an aggressive army is going to go in and they're going to basically sacrifice their backfield in order to do damage in the midfield and in your deployment zone. So if you can get past them, then you don't really care about their screening. They're not going to be able to screen you, and they're not going to be able to stop you. Whereas something like a control army or a defensive army, tactical becomes way better, because they're going to stop you from achieving your fixed very easily, because they're defensive, so they're hard to kill, hard to dig out those bring it downs, hard to dig out the assassinates, hard to get into their backfield for deploy teleport homers or behind enemy lines. So they can make it really hard for you to get those cards. And if you go into the middle, they're going to be able to fight you and push you off, so they're going to make it really hard. Whereas if you take tactical, all of a sudden, you know, you have the ability to flip that for CP, and you have the ability to go, cool, all I need to do is cleanse this turn, and there's no way that they can be on all 3 midfield objectives all game. So you just go, cool, this turn I cleanse those 2. Then they respond by sending units over, and you're like, cool, next turn I'm going to get my behind enemy lines over there. So, yeah, it sort of does tie in with the archetypes, where it's like certain archetypes are really hard to score fixed against, and other ones are really easy to score fixed against. But generally speaking, for most people, most of the time, I recommend using tactical. But yeah, no, that's a good question. But yeah, all right. I think we'll wrap it up here. Thanks heaps for your time, guys. I hope you guys found that interesting. If you did, I'd love any feedback that you have after this seminar. Just, you know, either send me a private message or chuck it in the Discord here. Because I'm looking to do this sort of thing a little bit more often, because I get a lot of people ask me for it. So yeah, I want to make sure that I'm getting good at it, so to speak, and make sure that I'm providing the value that people are after. So yeah, let me know what you think. And also just a quick plug for the YouTube channel. I've got a fundraiser raffle on over there, and then Team Australia, we're doing a bunch of fundraising work for that as well. So I appreciate any support that you guys can provide there. And I guess for most of you, I'm probably going to see at ANZTC. So I look forward to seeing you guys there, and we'll have to go get a drink together.
Well, thank you for your time. I don't see any other questions going on in the side chats.
Yep. No. All right. Awesome. Well, thanks for tuning in, and I'll talk to you guys soon.
Thanks, man.
All right. Cheers.
Thanks,
Bye.
man. Thanks heaps.
The Warhammer community suffers from some of the most prohibitively expensive essentials in the world, especially Australian content creators. Every single day, Dean wants to create content, but he can't. Suffering from old, worn-out brushes, expensive model kits, and costly software and equipment he can't endure much longer. Just look at this dirty paint water. Would you drink this? Would you let your child? Even a small monthly donation can help provide Dean with clean paint water, basic tools for survival, and access to life-saving information and education. So please, follow the links in the description below and find out how you can sponsor a mad cunt like Dean today and end the suffering. Suffering that is cruel, unsustainable, and your fault.